To me, it's a more complicated situation. I believe Shedeur Sanders needs to get the hell out of Cleveland. They finna have another quarterback battle next year when they draft another quarterback. I'm about 80% sure that's what they're going to do, bro. They're using Shedeur for like, image, and relevance. It's been reported that Shedeur Sanders will not play in the final preseason game, and the reason why is because the Browns' PR standpoint cannot survive the backlash. If
Shedeur Sanders thought the Browns were giving him a fresh start, but what happened next may have completely changed the story. After a shocking turn behind the scenes, whispers of a possible trade are suddenly getting louder. Could Cleveland really move on from Sanders this soon? And more importantly, who is already watching? The next move could expose exactly what went wrong.
And at the end of the day, this is a disservice to Shedeur Sanders. That's the biggest takeaway, local ties here in Colorado. Shedeur should have been a first-round pick. He made a lot of mistakes. You know, the way he showed up to the combine, the way he and his father handled everything. I understand why he fell, but that season he had in 2024 with the Buffs was worthy of him going in the top 10. Cam Ward went number 1 overall. I thought Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders had pretty similar college campaigns. A lot of the stuff was held against him, and a lot of it was his fault. And then he's gone up to Cleveland, gotten the speeding tickets. It hasn't been perfect by any stretch, but this dude just rotting on the bench on a terrible Browns team makes absolutely no sense.
The Cleveland Browns may have just created the one situation they were trying desperately to avoid, because after months of quarterback competition, the team has officially chosen Deshaun Watson to start the 2026 season, while Shedeur Sanders has been pushed into the backup role. On paper, that sounds like a simple football decision, but when you look at everything that has happened during this preseason, the story gets much more complicated.
You guys know Deshaun Watson was named the starter of the 2026 season. And I'm here to tell you, for us Shedeur fans, we will not see Shedeur Sanders until further notice. Shedeur Sanders will not play in this final preseason game against the Patriots. It look like they're going to let Dillon Gabriel and possibly Taylor Green play it out. What does that mean? That means either Deshaun Watson is on a short leash, and Shedeur, like I stated, we might see him week 3, bruh. I ain't taking that off the table.
And now, with Sanders being held out of Cleveland's final preseason game against the New England Patriots, another question has started to emerge. Could the Browns eventually become the reason Sanders ends up playing somewhere else?
Sanders, especially after a 9 of 11 weekend performance with a touchdown pass, would get the starting job for the Cleveland Browns, but no, Deshaun Watson, who was awful, beats him out. I think the kid deserves a shot. I don't think he's polished. I don't think he's great, but at least the fans like him, and when you're a bad team, being relatable and likable isn't the worst thing. Deshaun, I watched him play live a couple of weeks ago. To me, looks like a completely and absolutely expensive.
To be clear, there is no confirmed report that Cleveland is currently shopping Sanders in a trade, so nobody should start printing fake trade announcements just yet. However, the circumstances surrounding this quarterback room have created a situation where a trade could become a fascinating possibility if the Browns decide they have more quarterbacks than they can realistically keep.
I think it's best if Shedeur Sanders goes to another team, because ever since he's been in the NFL or went through the process of going to the NFL, he's had nothing but a hard time. And now when you go to a team like the Cleveland Browns, who already have a franchise quarterback in Deshaun Watson, and not to mention that they gave him a 5-year, $230 million contract, they're going to go to Deshaun Watson if they need a QB1. And we just saw that a couple of days ago when they named him the starter. The Browns front office, they're not going to let $200-300 million just sit on the sideline for some second-year player. It's kind of like a politics game.
That is where this story gets interesting, because Cleveland did not enter 2026 expecting this quarterback competition to become such a massive storyline. When the offseason began, the Browns had 4 quarterbacks competing for the job: Deshaun Watson, Shedeur Sanders, Dillon Gabriel, and Taylor Green. Sanders and Watson received the majority of the first-team work during the offseason program, setting up what looked like a genuine battle for the starting position. And for a while, it genuinely looked like Sanders had a chance. The former 5th-round pick was not simply standing around holding a clipboard while Watson reclaimed his old job. He was getting meaningful opportunities, taking first-team repetitions, and eventually starting the Browns' second preseason game against Buffalo after Watson started the opener against Chicago. That alone told you something had changed. Cleveland was not treating Sanders like an ordinary developmental quarterback. They were giving him a legitimate audition, and Sanders responded with moments that made the quarterback competition increasingly uncomfortable for the organization. Through the first 2 preseason games, Sanders completed 15 of 22 passes for 153 yards, 1 touchdown and 2 interceptions, while Watson completed 16 of 27 passes for 162 yards, no touchdowns, and 1 interception. Those numbers were not enough to make Sanders the obvious winner, but they certainly did not make the decision easy either.
And it was, I mean, as bad as it gets, he came in. He was not the first quarterback to come in. That was Shedeur. He came in with the second team and played with the third team and played against third team players. 5 of 12 for 36 yards. That is 3 yards an attempt. 0 touchdowns and interception. Had a 14.6 pass rating. The interception was on an arid pass that was airmailed out there. He had 1 good throw that I watched the whole game over the middle of the field, but his receiver was wide open. He had to slide for the football. This is not the same Deshaun Watson that we watched back in the day in the Houston Texans. Like, what are the Browns doing here?
I do kind of understand starting Deshaun Watson in the first couple games of the season, but it's backwards.
Then came the decision that changed everything. On August 24th, Browns head coach Todd Monken announced that Watson would open the regular season as Cleveland's starting quarterback, putting Sanders behind him on the depth chart. Monken also made it clear that this was not intended to be a week-to-week experiment. That is the part Sanders fans are struggling with. Because if the Browns had decided Watson was the starter after a completely dominant preseason, there would be very little to debate. But that is not what happened. Watson won the job despite a quarterback competition in which Sanders had shown enough progress to make the decision genuinely controversial. And then the Browns added another strange twist. But when you look at what this means for Sanders, the situation becomes much more interesting. Why give Gabriel and Green another valuable opportunity when Sanders has just been officially named Watson's backup? The simplest explanation is roster mathematics. Cleveland entered the preseason with 4 quarterbacks, and while having options sounds great in August, it quickly becomes complicated when the regular season roster has to be finalized.
So the Browns coaching staff really sent Shedeur Sanders out there with the wrong call-playing wristband? That means the plays that the coaches were calling were not the same play as Shedeur had in his wristband. So you have a rookie quarterback trying to run an NFL offense, but he has the wrong play sheet? And then he's running to the sidelines trying to get clarity, and then there's a delay of game. That's not a rookie mistake. That's not nerves. That is complete failure of the coaching staff. The Cleveland Browns have done everything they can to try and sabotage Shedeur's first year with them. Let that sink.
Watson is now the starter, Sanders has moved into the backup role, and Gabriel and Green are essentially competing for what could be the final quarterback spot. That makes the preseason finale less about Sanders and more about the players trying to prove that they deserve to remain in Cleveland. The Browns may already feel that they have seen enough from Sanders to understand where he fits into their plans, which is why there is no obvious reason to risk him in a game that could have more value for Gabriel and Green. However, this is also where the trade conversation becomes fascinating, because Cleveland's quarterback situation could eventually create a decision that has nothing to do with whether the Browns actually want Sanders gone. Right now, the logical scenario is that Cleveland keeps Watson and Sanders together, while Gabriel and Green fight for the remaining roster spot. If the Browns decide they want a third quarterback with more experience, Gabriel could have an advantage, so anyone presenting a Sanders trade as an established fact is getting ahead of the evidence. A potential trade is simply one of several possibilities that could emerge if Cleveland's quarterback situation changes during the season. And that possibility becomes considerably more interesting if Watson struggles. Because Sanders is entering his second NFL season, the Browns have already invested time developing him, and the organization now has a much better understanding of what he can and cannot do than it did when he arrived. If Watson plays well, there is little reason for Cleveland to disrupt the arrangement. Sanders can continue learning, preparing, and waiting for his opportunity.
Cleveland's going with Deshaun Watson as their starter over Shedeur Sanders. I can't make sense of it. Browns fans can't make sense of it. It's not that I'm the biggest Shedeur fan. It's that there's 100 reasons not to start Deshaun Watson. He's been out of football forever. He's got the track record. His fan base is not behind him, and he made that known, too, when he spoke to the media, that he feels more welcome at road games than he does at home. Well, that should tell you something. I've even heard, Marcus, Browns fans saying they should boycott the team essentially and just not go to games. There's every reason not to play Watson. And we just got another example of that in preseason week 2.
But if Watson struggles, every bad performance could reopen the debate that Cleveland just tried to close. The question from fans would inevitably become whether Sanders deserves a chance, and that conversation could become louder with every loss. Cleveland can name Watson the starter, but it cannot control what happens once the regular season begins. And if the results do not match the organization's expectations, the pressure surrounding that decision will only increase. Watson's situation is also complicated by the enormous financial commitment attached to him. When Cleveland acquired him from Houston in 2022, the Browns gave him a 5-year, $230 million contract that was fully guaranteed, making it one of the most significant financial commitments ever made to an NFL quarterback. The size of that contract means Watson's presence on the field is not simply a football decision. That financial reality does not automatically mean Watson should not start, and it certainly does not prove that Cleveland's decision was based entirely on his contract. However, it does explain why the situation carries so much pressure. If Watson performs well, Cleveland can point to the decision and say the plan worked. If he struggles, every missed opportunity for Sanders will become another talking point.
For whatever reason, this inferno effect with Cleveland, I want to see, because I think the GM's excellent, I want to see Shedeur play with this group. I was at the game when the Bears played the Browns a couple weeks ago at Soldier Field. I was there. Deshaun's shot. It's over. Deshaun can't play. It is over. I mean, the Bears defense, they were using backups. The Bears starters aren't great defensively. They don't have a ton of depth on that Bears defense. So Deshaun is, and he played a lot. Deshaun played against second and third team guys for the Bears and was ineffective. So it's like...
That is why the next few months could be extremely important for Sanders. If Watson succeeds, Sanders may spend the season developing behind him, and that could actually be beneficial for a young quarterback who is still learning the professional game. He can study defenses, continue learning the offense, improve his command at the line of scrimmage, and prepare without being forced into action before he is ready. However, if Watson struggles while Sanders continues showing progress behind the scenes, the situation becomes much more complicated. The Browns could eventually have to decide whether loyalty to their original plan is more important than responding to what is happening on the field. That is when Sanders' opportunity could arrive, and if he performs well, Cleveland could suddenly find itself holding a much more valuable asset than it expected. If Sanders develops the way Cleveland hopes, he could eventually become the type of quarterback other organizations would at least want to investigate. And ironically, the Browns' own quarterback controversy may be helping his reputation. When Sanders first entered the NFL, much of the conversation surrounding him involved his draft position, his father Deion Sanders, and the enormous attention that followed his name. Those storylines made it difficult to separate the player from the celebrity surrounding him.
No, look, I am a believer in Shedeur Sanders. I'm a believer in the way he's been brought up in the game of football, and I believe, given a fair and equitable shot, I do believe that he is someone who has starting potential. The Browns don't believe that, though. They have already delivered that message. They don't believe it. And we know that Deshaun is not the long-term answer. So to me, it doesn't really matter. This is going to be nothing but apathy just flowing through the streets of Cleveland this year because they've already turned the page to 2027. That's just the fact and that sucks for them. It really does. I've heard people talk on the show about the fact that Browns fans shouldn't go there. They should be ticked off. And you know what? As someone who played there for 3 years, when we had some pretty darn good football teams, but we didn't have a quarterback, I understand just how that frustrates.
Now, the conversation is gradually becoming more football-focused. People are watching how Sanders operates the offense, how he handles pressure, how he moves inside the pocket, and how quickly he is adapting to his second NFL offense. The more he demonstrates that he can function as an NFL quarterback rather than simply as a famous rookie, the easier it becomes for teams around the league to evaluate him on football terms. That could matter enormously if Cleveland ever decides it has to make a difficult decision about its quarterback room. The preseason competition also gave Sanders something he could not have manufactured through interviews or social media: direct comparison with the player Cleveland chose to make its starter. Watson may have the contract, the experience, and the organizational investment, but Sanders has the advantage of being younger and still developing. If the gap between them appears smaller than expected, that becomes a significant piece of information for the Browns. The Browns have already given him opportunities to prove himself. Now they are using the final game to evaluate other players, which could simply mean the organization believes it knows enough about Sanders for the moment. That does not mean he has been forgotten.
You said he and the staff. I don't believe he and the staff had any say in this. I think it came above his pay grade, and they made a decision, and he says, okay, me and my staff made this decision.
Listen, I told you. Obviously, the coach. I'm not saying he's a puppet. I'm not saying that. But I knew all along. I knew all along, for one, Uncle Joe, that Deshaun was going to start simply because of the money that's owed to him this season. That's it. So understanding that, Todd Monken is in a tough position when he can't answer the question like he really wants to answer it. You know, saying that based on his performance, and we feel he gives us our best chance to win. But if you look at the numbers, that's not the person that gives you your best chance to win.
If anything, his next meaningful opportunity could be much more important because it would come in a regular season environment where the stakes are significantly higher. That is when the real pressure begins. If Watson starts the season strongly, Sanders will have to wait patiently. If Watson struggles, the fan base will likely begin asking questions. If Watson gets injured, Sanders could immediately become one of the most important players on the roster. If Sanders then enters the game and performs well, Cleveland could have an entirely different problem on its hands. The Browns could discover that their backup quarterback has become valuable enough to attract interest from other teams. That is where a trade becomes possible. But it is important to understand the sequence. The Browns could begin the season believing Watson and Sanders are their answer, only to discover that circumstances have created an entirely different situation by November. That is why Sanders' future should not be judged solely by whether he starts week 1. Sometimes the most important part of a young quarterback's development happens while he is not playing. He can learn from every mistake Watson makes, observe how defenses attack the offense, study how the starter handles pressure, and continue improving without carrying the responsibility of an entire franchise on his shoulders. If that development eventually turns him into a legitimate starter, Cleveland will have to decide whether to keep him, elevate him, or listen to offers.
So you're telling me that the NFL, the Browns, Todd Monken and these boys, you're telling me with a straight face that they feel like Deshaun Watson gives them a better chance to win than Shedeur Sanders? You're lying to me, bro. You're lying to me, bro. You can't BS me. Y'all tried to BS me last year with Dylan Gabriel, and what is he? The third string guy. Y'all are not gonna try to BS me, dog. I know what it is. It's collusion. It's collusion. This is Colin Kaepernick-esque. It is. Because it's so blatantly obvious that the NFL is against this man.
At that point, the Browns would have to decide which young quarterback they actually believe in, because carrying several developmental quarterbacks forever is not exactly a revolutionary roster-building strategy. This is why Sanders' performance during the regular season will matter so much, even if he spends most of the early season on the sideline. Every practice, every preseason evaluation, and eventually every regular season snap will contribute to the organization's understanding of his value. If Watson plays well, Sanders' value inside Cleveland remains that of a promising young backup. If Watson struggles and Sanders gets his opportunity, that value could rise dramatically. If Sanders plays well enough to attract interest from another team, the Browns could suddenly have a decision that many teams would love to face, whether to keep a talented young quarterback or turn his value into assets elsewhere. That is a very different problem from simply trying to find a quarterback. That is a much more dangerous question. At that point, the question may no longer be whether Sanders can win the starting job. The question could become whether Cleveland can afford to keep him. That is why the Sanders story is far from over, despite the Browns making their decision. And if the Browns thought naming Watson QB1 would finally silence the Shedeur Sanders debate, they may have underestimated just how quickly an NFL season can turn a supposedly settled decision into the biggest question in the building.